Thank you very much, and welcome with this webinar about the rights, mobility for right. I'm very happy that we have the same persons with us as we had in ITS World Congress in Dubai. And the reason why we invited the same persons is that there was too little time to mention too much things, and we really want to have this discussion about what can we do with mobility for rights. Today we have again Susan Harris from ITS Australia, who will moderate the session. Hi and good morning for you, Susan. Tilly Cheng from San Francisco Country Transport Authority. Hi Tilly, well, and good to see you. Mike Rich coming from New Zealand, ITS. Hi Mike. And Nico Lago, also coming from Oregon. Thank you for joining us. Susan, how are you doing? I want to first thank you very much for being with us again, and it's quite hard to get us all on the same page. Susan, what we've done in Dubai, and I know most of the people who are listening to this one are familiar with this, is the discussion about the right for everybody to have mobility or have access to mobility. Can you lead us to what's going on and moderate the session to see where we are heading for and what the opinions are of our people? Susan, can I give you and provide you with the floor?
Yeah, thanks very much, Rolf. Thanks for bringing together such a great panel and providing an opportunity for us to continue the conversation in Dubai. I think it's a really topical issue at the moment. You know, we've just had our program committee for our upcoming conference in mobility, and one of the really strong things coming out of that was around the focus on accessibility and the role of ITS. So it's a pretty hot topic. Just quickly, also up in Queensland, you know, one of Australia's largest states, they've recently moved to 50-cent public transport fares. So any journey that you take is topped out, you know, you pay 50 cents. So I think we're really interested to hear how that pans out and, you know, what the implications for the transport uptake are in that, and how it improves accessibility across the city. So yeah, we've got this great panel, Rolf. Thank you very much for bringing us all back together again. But I'm really interested to hear from our panelists as to your thoughts on accessibility for all and how that's being tackled in your jurisdictions. So Tilly, I might ask you just to kick us off in terms of San Francisco. What are your thoughts? What's happening in San Francisco around improving accessibility to transport, and the tactics and visions for you?
Thank you so much. Thank you, Rolf and Susan. It's an honor to be with everyone again to address this very important question. You know, for each community, I think how we approach access to mobility, you know, or our rights around this topic, you know, it's a question of values. And then it becomes a question of policy. You know, San Francisco, I feel, has such an engaged community and a proud history of what we call a transit-first policy. And that does not mean transit only. It means as we look to planning, designing, and investing, you know, for all the ways people get around, goods and services and people, that we're planning for everyone, and we're taking an approach where everyone's included, and that this is reflected in our practices, right? Our values translate into how do we provide for particularly the needs and the mobility for the most vulnerable, but everyone, right? And that expression of how we design and build our cities is our values in practice. And many folks have talked about this, you know, much more eloquently than I, you know, the Peñalosas, and many of you all have also talked about these concepts. It's the physical manifestation, right, of physical access and barriers, and who has that access, and are we designing for all universal design, the affordability of our transportation and mobility. Certainly the safety, the cultural appropriateness, and the accessibility for folks with different languages, perhaps, or other practices from a cultural standpoint. And finally, the ability to engage in decision making. You know, whether it's something as big as how we fund public transportation, which we are engaged in right now, which serves everyone, to something as small as a parking space, on any given curb in San Francisco. We're going to get a lot of opinions. And it's really important when we talk about, access to mobility and ensuring that that is available for everyone, that decision making is something that is open and that is inclusive. Not everyone's going to be able to decide. There's only going to be, so much time and ability for those who are making decisions to get input. But it's really important to be inclusive in that process. And we strive very hard to ensure that good information, reliable information is provided in not only digital, but non-digital means. And so everyone who has a desire to weigh in has the information and the ability to do so. So that's a starting point.
I think we really like the idea that it's a value-based perspective, and if you get those foundations and those assumptions right, that we're going to be using transit as a way to make sure everyone's got access to good transport, and that then sets a really strong foundation. Nico, from your perspective, how do you roll this out for your organisations, and what do you see?
Yeah, so I lots of agreement with things that Tilly talked about. When we think about the right to mobility, it's really about this question of equity and making sure everyone has access to get to the things that they need to get to, access to jobs, to education, to services, and transit is a key piece of this, a key way of doing this. It has to be the backbone of any equitable transportation strategy. And as Tilly mentioned, getting people there physically, having the economic ability to do those things, culturally making sure everything's in all the different languages that needs to be absolutely important. I think one of the things that we look at a good amount is that when we say this idea of the right to mobility, an assumption that is underlying there is what's the development pattern behind these things, right? So if we have all sorts of different development patterns, dense, very less dense, tremendously less dense. How do we provide transportation to everyone who's in these positions? And how do we incentivize people to make decisions that make it easier to get to those transportation options? So if we say that we are fine with having this really low density, sprawling type of development, and yet we still think that development, there's a right to mobility, well, those things become really, really expensive. So figuring how it is that you can weigh these two things to make sure that you're able to do them both.
And Nico, do you think, that's where I kind of see there's the opportunity for technology to play a really powerful role? That we know not everyone's on their devices every day, it's kind of nearly everyone. But is that where we can really step in to make sure that we can be flexible to get transit where it needs to be, to improve the connectivity perhaps and make it more attractive? I mean, are you seeing anything in that space in Oregon?
Oh, absolutely. So we do a lot of work. So I'm a professor at the University of Oregon, but I also am a researcher and a strategic advisor at TNO, which is a Dutch national think tank. And we've done a lot of work in both locations on mobility as a service and really looking at it as a way of building, having, again, as I mentioned before, this backbone in transit, but using these emerging technologies to kind of fill the first last mile and to fill gaps within this, which to me seems to be one of all the emerging technology that we have happening right now in the transportation sector, is one that really points to the best outcomes. I'd say the ability to leverage this technology to get the best outcomes in terms of environment, in terms of equity, in terms of accessibility. And so we see enormous opportunities for this. As we know, mobility as a service, or now it's being talked about as public mobility, has a ton of opportunity, but also a ton of challenges to get it to happen. So yes, a lot of work needs to be done in that space.
Yeah, I think it's a real opportunity to try and make a difference in that area. I really think that we have both sprawling suburbs in Australia, and I know many cities, in the US as well, but also rural and regional areas where we have lower density, but we're still trying to provide good quality transit, because we're finding, particularly, it's interesting as you bring down the price of those public transit fares for us in Australia, is what we're going through at the moment. We're getting pushback from regional communities because they don't have the same access, why should that? They're seeing that they're having to subsidise cheaper transit for those in large urban areas when they don't have good access to transit themselves. So I'm interested, you know, either Mike, Nico, or Tilly around that on-demand transport, whether you're seeing that playing a role in improving transit in, you know, lower density areas, if we call them that. Is that, or are there other things that you're seeing having an impact? Tilly?
Oh, or Mike was starting to talk, but
Mike?
I think you're muted, Mike.
Go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, in New Zealand, we've done a number of mobility on-demand trials, and as far as I'm aware, all but one of them have been pretty successful in terms of getting the transport advantage to actually start to use public transport where they couldn't before, and also improving the overall use on the main trunks of mobile networks. However, there seems to be and one of my concerns as well, I'm passionate about the role of mobility for all to actually get an overall economic solution to our transit and transport problems. I see the political will just waxes and wanes, and so does the funding. And it only kind of needs one trial that doesn't go quite right, and the politicians tend to latch onto that one and forget about all the trials that go well, and suddenly that's the excuse to not continue. And so I think one of the things that we need to be able to do is use some of the data that we can generate to provide the information to the politicians to prove how good things are in the areas they are, plus also flex and change some of the trials and rollouts that we do to make them more effective, rather than let them run. I've certainly seen one of the trials just ran into the ground, not delivering, but yet they weren't trying new routes and new tweaks to it. So we have to be able to manage that sort of thing to be able to give the politicians confidence that they're making the right decisions.
Yeah, I mean, that's really interesting. The whole concept of a trial, you would hope that it's got some flexibility, that we can learn as we go, we can make tweaks and adjustments, you know, understanding that these are new things we're doing. We don't expect to get them spot on, you know, straight away.
And I also think that there's a lot of the trials around mobility on demand that we could do better by sharing the results around the world, but where we're trialing them, the communities are actually probably a lot more similar than some of our heavy urban areas. And so what are those lessons that we learn? What can we take from one jurisdiction to another to be able to say, let's implement this here because we know it worked there.
Yeah, Tilly, San Fran's
I might try to address your question as well from our Bay Area standpoint. I was just at an AVs and public transit conference yesterday happening here in the Bay Area, and we spent a lot of time, you know, talking about a lot of experimentation and you know, good to really good success for microtransit services, particularly maybe for some places that are less dense. Maybe more suburban, and even in San Francisco, for example, we have our like neighborhoods on the outer parts of the city, or in Treasure Island, where we had a successful autonomous vehicle shuttle pilot last year. That's not microtransit or on demand, but there's, you know, there's a lot of experimentation and good experience, I think. It's always a question of how to keep those sustainable, because for the most part, they will require subsidy, and it's part of this big transformation, you know, that is economy-wide. You know, we certainly see the rise of ride-hail and even autonomous, you know, robot taxis as we see in San Francisco, but that's not for everyone. Not everyone can participate in that and afford that. And we want to make sure that those services are also complementary to transit. But, you know, when we come to things like microtransit, that is something that we are joining with many other cities to figure out what is the right application. First, last mile seems to be a sweet spot And certainly bringing in the community to design those is critical, as well as labor and our operating partners, not as stakeholders, but really as co-creators of, what does this mean? What does this transition potentially mean as we utilize some of these technology innovations in the production of public transportation services for everyone?
Yeah, fantastic. I think it's really challenging walking that path of the economic viability and the subsidies. And I think, that sort of conflict in terms of accessibility to or usability. I know in Melbourne, everyone loves our tram network because they know exactly where they go and they can pretty much turn up and grab one. And that's almost the opposite of on-demand transit, where you need to understand how to access it, how to call it to you. You've got to have the right fit solution for the right location and demographic. You can't have our tram network all across regional Australia, for example. But it's really interesting challenges we're grappling with. Nico, you talked about some of the data and some of your research and advisory work that you're engaged in. How are you finding data's making a difference, or what are some of the findings that you're coming across?
So I'll talk about it in two ways. One, we'll talk about data standards, and then we'll also talk about the data. So in some of the projects that we're looking at, we are seeing like fantastic results. I mean, so you look at some of the things that are happening, for instance, in some trials that are happening at TransLink with this kind of mobility as a service model that they've put together. And they're in early trials of this. They've gone through one phase of pilot, but the outcomes have been fantastic. I mean, a ton of people who had never used transit using it for the first time, people who rarely use transit using it more. They've been trying to be a little bit sober about this and said, these results look way better than what we thought was going to happen. But oh my goodness, if you can have these kinds of outcomes, like fantastic. And a little bit going to what Mike was saying before, some of these trials are really turning out, really, really positive. And so, the need, we're actually helping TransLink right now in full disclosure on a second phase that they're working on to see how these things kind of work. Just to jump on the data side of this, one of the issues that tends to run into a whole lot of problems. I mean, we talked a lot about the barriers of making these things happen, getting everyone to work on the same system. There's just so much cost that's involved in creating new systems everywhere. And what we had in this kind of these early iterations of mobility as a service has been a whole lot of every city kind of inventing it and starting from scratch. And that's actually created a whole lot of problems, which you continue to see some places, trying to think of the new data string that needs to happen or how to organize these things, and that creates a whole lot of problems for a lot of the companies that are supplying transportation services are national and international companies, and so finding ways to integrate these companies easier, making it easier for them to integrate, just makes the whole thing work easier, which lets you provide more transportation more easily, more affordably, which actually goes back to the key of what we're talking about. Lets more people have equitable access to transportation.
Yeah, look, that data standards, it's such an opportunity. If we're all doing the same sort of thing, so that we can connect together those data layers, makes it much more of a turnkey solution to deliver those outcomes. But I know just from my experience, the different jurisdictions we've got here, they'll tend to move ahead independently. They've all got their own legacy systems. But conversely, then we'll have a smaller jurisdiction speaking up and saying, well, who's taking the lead here? Who's setting the standard? We just want to pick it up and roll. So what do you think the solution is then, Nico? Or do others of you have any views around how we can do better at that standardisation of the data exchange in the mobility space?
I'll just say, using standards that have been used elsewhere, especially for mid and smaller size cities, do not reinvent what's happening. Find successes that exist in large cities. I mean, I'm thinking of some of the things that have happened, for instance, in Berlin or Vienna, and places where companies that you want to attract are already working. Use those standards, use those systems. So it makes it much more easier. I'm not going to say it's completely easy, but it's much easier for a company to say, like, well, we've already integrated this entire system, and now we're going to point it to this other city. So I think that's probably one of the most important things to be doing.
So spend some time, do a bit of research as to what's good out there. I'm sure people have already got a view on that, and then pick it up and roll it out. Yeah.
So I would suggest, again, this came up as well recently in the conferences that I attended, and it was, discussed at TRB as well. There are emerging standards that LA pioneered, for example, the Mobility Data Specification, MDS, that many, like 300 cities are already using for scooters and bike share, micro-mobility, that we hope will extend also to curbs with curb data standards. And again, as many cities are initiating those types of pilots, we're going to learn so much more. And really businesses will be able to plug into those solutions better if we are able to standardize, what is expected. And that comes down largely to procurement and the ability for owners and sponsors to really insist on and require certain, open APIs and ways to integrate to promote the best solutions, right? And for that to be something that everyone can start to rely on commercially, I think is important. So whether it's locally funded or federally or otherwise, this is a big policy issue. I'll just note that ITIS America, on which I'm a board member, we want to just promote this idea of, with ITS Australia and the World Congress and everybody involved in the industry, that we really seek partnerships to establish, what are those best practices and what are the barriers and what are still the issues? Because if it were easy, it'd be done by now. So there's got to be a reason, and there are many important reasons for both public and private providers for why it's not as mature. But we feel that with partnership, we can, start to make better progress.
And I'll just add to I think one of the things Tilly just mentioned is really important about the partnership is it has to be with the private sector as well. I mean, it has to be hand in hand. So right now we're actually doing some research with a couple of different cities on the OMF's curb standards, and there's a lot of really good energy around that. The question is, are some of the large companies that use these things going to engage? And it's just critical that we get the private sector being part of these conversations, on board, seeing the value add at scale. That's where we're going to actually be able to make some of the changes.
Yeah, I think it's really critical getting, first of all, knowledge around the fact that these standards are around, and we're being quite successful in getting most of the jurisdictions around Australia as observing members of mobility data services. But then also that opportunity to continue to be engaged and connect, to be a part of the standards as they evolve. We're not going to have a standard that's developed in LA that meets the needs of, operations across Europe, across Asia Pac. So, and the other thing, which I think which we see every day as well, again, particularly some of our smaller jurisdictions, they're just really resource scarce. So, they're keen to be engaged and connected, but there's only so many meetings that there's time for in the day, and they've got less people to do kind of the same scope of services. That might be a smaller geographic area, but the complexity and the issues that they're dealing with are not a lot less. Rolf, what are you seeing from your role in this space?
I'm a little bit surprised by the fact that we are still seeking for finding the spot between private and public to connect, to align, to collaborate on not just standards or on the exchange of data or on the progress to create on-demand services to lower the barrier to have access to transport. This is what we are trying to do for decades now, and I'm very keen to focus more on not it's a new standard, because Nico, I'm completely fair and honest. Every city is reinventing the wheel again over and over, and that's not what. So we are doing something wrong with showing the world what's the best standard to choose from, and it's up to them to make a decision. What we also don't do is, unfortunately, there are some generic processes like ticketing, payment, booking, planning, settlements, and we don't agree on how we want to do this on a more centralized level. which is strange because every district, every country is having the same issues. What can we do to make sure that we can connect, we can exchange, and we can provide one UI or one solution for all people who wants to have access to transport in this case? It's still not there. And the way that we from the MaaS Alliance are looking at it is what can we do to make sure that we can provide the marketplace in such a way that it's an open puzzle for everybody to pick and cherry what you need. But 80% is the same, 20% is something you have to fill in by your own local city from your own political ways. So this is something we are not doing well because it's still an ongoing issue. And the other part is the reason why this input is so important is to make sure that the process to lower the cost to have a better access of mobility for everybody who needs to have access to mobility to the right. It's not just lower it, but it's also to make sure that on demand is working, that transport can be optimized, that we can optimize infrastructure in such a way that we don't have to build it. It's much more than just lowering the barrier. It's focusing on the propositions. It's focusing on what we really need to do to make sure that we can provide the right propositions and right tools for everybody. And that's something we don't do, not enough. We're not sharing it enough. And the good examples, they're not that strong because we still do not see them all over the world as popping up saying, all right, this is what we can do to make sure that this is working. So I'm looking in a big mirror and saying, what can we do to make sure that we can provide the tools or we can provide the knowledge? So some people can just delegate their time on infrastructure and optimizing infrastructure. Some people can delegate their time on demand services so we don't have empty public transport. Or some people can optimize the time to make sure that the propositions are working to optimize the accessibility and livability for all people, meaning what are the real important groups of people groups, stakeholders, which we need to serve. And that's a democratic, from a democratic point of view, but also from a social point of view, the more vulnerable people, what can we do to serve them? And that's something we don't see, or we don't find the studies where in this direction. But it's all there. We need to connect it and we need to provide it. And that's something we don't do or not good enough, unfortunately.
Yeah, that connection, internationally to get the best information and to understand what's available. I mean, I think, having the privilege to travel, one of the things that I find that, once you've cracked the public transport system in a particular location, it gives you a whole level of comfort. But, we still continue to have different systems and different ways. We know it's a barrier to connecting with the city is learning how to access the transit networks. So because they're all different, inherently to some extent they've got a different network, so they do need to be different. But I think that in itself, is a bit of an opportunity.
One of the things that we've just, one of the things that we've just, for 15 to 20 years, so but within the next 2 years it will be a wide system. So whichever city you get in, you will be using the same card, same system, same back office. So that overcomes some of those first steps that Roloff was talking about, because if you arrive in New Zealand soon, you don't have to have the 5 different cards, or in fact 7 or 8 different that you need at the moment. One card phone will do the whole country. Now,
so what Mike's saying is that they're moving to a national system for ticketing all across New Zealand.
Yes.
Hey, can I add? Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. I think that the next step then is to then, and I've been talking to the manager about it, how will the wide mobility issues and first and last mile, which is not provided by the transit operators, be then integrated into that. And they've spent a lot of time getting the platform right so that they're confident that they will be able to do that. In fact, I've got a meeting them next week to talk about some of those things. So. If
I could jump in, one of the things I think that's really interesting that Rolf Rolf talked about and Mike just talked about, that was a big theme in our conversation that we had in Dubai, is the need to develop established trust between a whole lot of different stakeholders in this.
Yep.
And it's funny because when we think about the right to transportation, or the cost of transportation, equity of transportation, we often think about well what kind of wheels do we have on the ground, and what kind of systems are we using, what kind of technology, how are we paying for this, all this. And one of the things in the research that we've done, and we've talked to a whole lot of people in the public sector and private sector side, the number one thing that comes up first is, like, if you want to make this system work, just establish trust, right? And it's just so clear that is something that we sometimes overlook or don't realize it's the most important thing. I'll give you one anecdote that to me is just so telling. Yellowbee, which is the one of the systems that exists in Berlin, enormous system. I think they have 50 different providers that are integrated into this one system. When they started this, when it was first like a concept, the first person they hired wasn't a technology person, right? Wasn't an operations person. The very first person they hired was a relationships manager, right? Like someone to go and talk to everyone to figure out what is needed, bring everyone on board, make sure everyone's being heard. And to me, that's like critical. If we want to make transit or transportation, and I think transit is an important piece of that, really work for everyone, that's like one of the first steps that we need to take.
I second that. I think the reason it took so long to get the national ticketing system wasn't a technology issue. It was getting everyone talking on the same language issue, understanding the same objectives, and when we were talking about 17 different transit authorities across New Zealand, all wanting to do their own thing, all had to give something to be part of something bigger, and that took most of the time. The actual technology rollout is probably less than a third of that time.
So, Mike, who took the lead on making that happen?
Sorry, Susan, it's your call.
I was asking who took a lead on pulling those 17 agencies together to make that happen.
So,
who was with?
So,
what was the thing that clinched it?
The first step was it was given to the New Zealand Transport Agency, who had that wider brief than just a single jurisdiction. Their brief is make sure that there's an efficient transport system across the whole country, and that's not just transit. So they took that lead. But the political support for it has waxed and waned over the years. There's actually been about 4 different changes in government of both left and right wing. But even as the program is being rolled out, there's still a number of jurisdictions that are saying, well, we might not join in the end. And the final impetus to do that is in what we call our government policy statement, which has said that no one will get transit subsidy from government unless they join it. So that's been that final impetus to make that happen. But I think once we again, it's like the backbone of your transit network. It's a backbone of the payment system, getting the payment system and being able to integrate that with all the other end-to-end users, first and last mile and what have you. That's going to be what makes mobility. That's what's going to take the national ticketing system to deliver mobility for all. That's what's going to be required.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting when we think about the traditional relationship between the private sector and the agencies, that it's very contract, transactional related. We've got a procurement process, we've got a contract, we've got enforcement, and that's kind of the antithesis of trust, So, trying to move to a more dynamic relationship where we're sharing things that's not necessarily specified exactly in the contract. takes time. So we've found some of our experience is that by working on small research projects, we can get people together around the table for conversations, that we can get different jurisdictions working together, private and public sector working together. They then start to understand the complexity of issues, and they get to understand the individuals. And then that kind of rolls on to that foundation, I guess, of trust and exploring, and challenging each other to explore the possible by having kind of these sidebar conversations in the research space. I find that really valuable.
And Tilly mentioned earlier on about procurement being key for standards, but it's also key for getting that trust, having the right KPIs that will motivate people to behave in the right way. And I'm not sure how many of you attended the World Congress in Suzhou, but one of the things that came through there with their mobility as a service where it was working in China was when they drove the responsibility of that on the major transit supplier, giving them benefits and incentives to link with the other suppliers to increase overall patronage on their own links.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, I think we're getting towards the end of our time. So what I might do is just run around our panel again and ask for your sort of closing thoughts. If you can summarise into what you think is the one thing we should be looking at to support the rollout of mobility of all, more generally or within your patch, that'd be fantastic. Tilly, what are your thoughts in that space?
Right. I think we should just keep striving, and deploying and, move things out of pilots and research and as much as possible into deployment, understanding that risk is always involved. And for the public sector, there's lower tolerance, but there is tolerance. And I think we must get creative. So instead of talking about risk, I'd like to talk about creativity and talk about co-creation and creating that value and aligning our incentives. Whether you're a company, whether you're the community partner, whether you're labor, whether you're the government entity, there are ways to align our incentives and to ensure that we have mutually beneficial, right, opportunities to create amazing new systems that benefit our safety, climate, equity, and mobility goals. And I think that takes leadership. And it takes risk taking and again creativity, and I'm very hopeful, that even if it's at the local level, even if it's small, but taking, the act of taking the action, I think is the first step.
Yeah, you can't do anything unless you start. So yeah, thanks very much, Tilly. Nico, what are your thoughts in that space?
I would say agree a ton. Like we got to get things on the ground and moving. I think we do a lot of research into the role of the public sector in kind of doing all this. I think there's a huge role for the public sector to be taking in bringing people to the table and helping develop that trust. And as Tilly was saying, aligning the goals, aligning the motivations, making sure everyone's pushing the same direction so that you can actually move much quicker, get things out, test, adjust, and keep going. There's just a huge role for the public sector to be playing in that.
Yeah, fantastic. Thanks, Nico. Mike, you're involved in the strategic planning for New Zealand in this space. Well, what are you seeing as the big issues that you're tackling?
Well, I think one of the big issues is sharing experiences and what have you, because a lot of people, and it's been addressed a few times, people have a tendency to start from scratch, and there's so much more potential to start from further down the track because someone's done something similar, and to overcome that, well, what's going on in Taiwan is not relevant to here, when in fact it may well be, because Taiwan's got all sorts of different communities, or what's happening in San Francisco isn't relevant. So I think working out how to share those experiences, and I think the co-creation that Tilly talked out and that go pick up on is a key learning that we need to be able to get people to understand that co-creation of some of these things to set up successful deployments or deployments that have got the highest chance of success is so critical. So if we can work out better ways to share between the people that are deploying, that would be a huge step.
Yeah, thanks very much, Mike. I think they're sound words. And Roelof, from your perspective, to wrap up from your view at MaaS Alliance?
The collaboration, working together and making data available to start learning from it, and stop talking about standards, because that's a decision you have to make, and make the decision and start working on the outputs, propositions and deployment, because that's where we can make the difference, that's where we can make the impact, and that's where we can show what we want to achieve, gain the trust and facilitate the people that we want to serve, need to serve. And those people are not us, but that's the next generation. So deploy now means let's exchange the knowledge we have and keep on working to make this difference. Otherwise it's too late. And that's the main goal, deploy.
Yeah, fantastic. Look, it's been a really great conversation this morning for me, this afternoon for some of you, or this evening. We've heard about some of the challenges around, dealing with lower density areas, whether it be remote or whether it be outer urban. The benefits of starting from a values-based approach so that everyone's kind of thinking in that right direction. Some of the opportunities, I guess, from data, we can call it challenges or opportunities to, really get on board and leverage some of those efficiencies so that we can roll this out more quickly in a more integrated fashion. But then what really rang true to me was the conversation about the way we need to approach it and bring players together. So the building of that trust, the time and effort that goes into building alignment. So that's, that doesn't just happen, that takes time. And that need to be creative. So, I guess trying new things, being prepared to improve and give it a go. But overall, that challenge of getting that alignment across the large number of stakeholders that are active and engaged in this space. So Roelof and our panellists, really like to thank you all for your time and coming together and sharing your thoughts. I think these opportunities to continue to engage in this space are really valuable to look at where things are at and how we can come forward together. Looking forward to assisting in some planning for the World Congress, which is coming up in Atlanta later this year. So I'll be over assisting that later in February. But also just an invitation to everyone, ITS Australia, we have our Mobility 25 conference coming up on the 15th and 16th of May this year in Sydney, in beautiful Sydney. We'll have a great lineup of speakers, some local, some international. So I'd like to extend an invitation for everyone to come to that as a prelude to what we might see at the World Congress. So thanks everyone for your time today, and it's been really great to catch up. Thank you
very much, Susan,
Thank you.
and Mike.